Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 122. I'm talking to Daniel Raisbeck. He works at the Cato Institute. He's their resident expert on what's going on in South America. And guess what we're going to talk about? Yes, Javier Milei. With the election coming up in 2 days, hopefully I can get all these shows uploaded by then. We'll talk about what's going to happen with Javier Milei and hopefully what's been happening in maybe all over South America too. I don't know. We might probably ought to talk a little bit about Ecuador as well. But yes, how are you, Daniel?
Fine. It's great to be on your podcast.
Thank you. Just if we can do a quick brief, how did you become a libertarian and how did you get into this?
It's a good question. I seem to recall that I first started paying attention after the Ron Paul campaigns.
Okay.
And I mean, it sounded a bit eccentric, but then you started thinking about it and it made a lot of sense. And I started doing some research and I actually came across the Cato Institute and I attended an event in Argentina that we do. We're actually holding a similar event in Ecuador next month. And it's basically an introduction to classical liberalism for university students or actually anyone between the ages of 18 and 30. And so it's a very good 2 or 3 day event. And I went to one precisely in Buenos Aires. And well, that's how I started becoming a libertarian and getting to know the authors and getting to know which books to read and all of that. And that's how it all started.
Are you from down there? I know you ran for office in Colombia once.
Yeah, I am from Colombia. That's where I'm originally from.
Yeah, so that's cool. So when did you first learn about Javier Milei?
Well, I don't remember exactly when, but it was several years ago when he started becoming a media personality. I seem to recall that I actually knew him. I don't know him personally. I've never met him, but I was aware of him even before as an economist. But I seem to recall he was more of a quote-unquote serious economist at the World Economic Forum and that kind of thing before he started becoming more histrionic, let's say, on national TV, which is, I think, really when he started becoming very well known.
Yeah, well, I don't think people are going to tune in to watch economists just talk about economics. I think they'd probably fall asleep if it was just
absolutely
standard economists. But he adjusted his delivery to television, and it's clearly worked. I think that the first show I ever got on was Alejandro Fantino, I think.
I mean, I don't know which show it was. But right, as I said before, I think he still had the hair, but I don't think he was as much of a showman. And then when he started doing that, he was obviously tremendously successful. And I think there's some idiosyncrasies about Argentina and Argentine television. For instance, the fact that he constantly swears, and apparently he's not the only one. Whereas, for instance, in Colombia, where I'm from, that's not very common on TV. And I don't think if you did that, you would be allowed a lot of time swearing on national TV. So I think he very skillfully used the platforms that he had to become like a national persona.
Do South Americans do they all pretty much watch the TV in their own country, or does it all kind of mix together? Argentines watching Colombian TV, Peruvians watching Ecuadorian TV,
I think in general, my impression, and I was the chief editor of the Pan Am Post for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And my impression is that most people are only interested in politics in their own country.
Okay.
But of course, there's still a regional sensitivity. And especially when there's someone very out of the ordinary, charismatic, even if it's on the left or on the right. Of course, Hugo Chavez, everyone was paying attention to whatever Hugo Chavez was doing. Of course, Hugo Chavez had a very, like Fidel Castro, a very international approach, interventionist approach. He was intervening in elections and financing left-wing candidates all over the place. So of course, I think in the last 20 years, politics has become more international, and of course, I mean, people pay attention to some degree to U.S. politics, but in general, I think there's a general level of ignorance about what's going on in other Latin American countries.
I wasn't sure we have so many. Some of the countries are smaller and it's all the same language, although there's different
Right.
accents. But yeah,
And the smaller the country, the less attention usually paid in terms of its internal politics and policies. One exception, of course, lately is Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, and this applies not only to Latin America. I mean, not only did other Latin Americans pay very little attention to El Salvador before Bukele, but I think in the world, in the U.S. and Europe, very few people knew what El Salvador was, and all of a sudden, because of his style of politics, uh, he's all over. I don't know if he's all over the news, but he's definitely all over social media. So, with the advent of social media, I think this is something that has made politics, or at least it's given the potential for local politics to become international politics.
Yeah, it has. Well, Bukele is getting all that attention from Bitcoiners, but yeah. So what
He
do
was
you
getting
think?
the attention. He was getting the attention from Bitcoiners before, and I think after that may be a reason, I'm not sure, but after the most recent collapse in price, although Bitcoin of course has recovered a bit, but Bukele was buying at the top, and I think that may be a reason why he decided to focus more on a very draconian security strategy to draw attention from the whole Bitcoin thing.
True. So what do you think Milei is doing right that other politicians haven't done, whether it be Ron Paul or Justin Amash or
Right. Well, I mean, I think there's several factors. On the one hand, I think it's undeniable, and you have to give him credit because he has an uncanny ability. I mentioned he was a showman, and he has the ability to connect on different levels because he can come here potentially to Cato, for instance, and give a lecture on some subject of Austrian school economics, or at least how that applies to Argentina and the history of inflation that they've had. So he can talk to the academic libertarians on very equal terms. But his quote unquote superpower, I think, is the way he can communicate those ideas or very similar ideas to the ordinary man in Argentina, which not a lot of academic libertarians can do. So I think that's his great ability. And I think even Ron Paul and definitely Rand Paul, they're known for kind of their professorial style.
Yeah.
Where they'll lose people. People don't really know what they're talking about in terms of auditing the Federal Reserve and all of that. And I guess Milei has a little bit of that when he gets into very technical economic terms, but he has the ability to connect and to explain to just a regular person why the ideas of classical liberalism work when they are implemented and why they work above all for ordinary people. And I think that's an immense talent. On the other hand, there are factors in Argentina that I think have also helped him to rise. So it's far easier, I think, to connect with this message of, for instance, dollarization, which I have talked about and proposed for many years in Colombia. But I think when you have triple-digit inflation and 90% devaluation in just a matter of years, it's a lot easier to connect when you have a large devaluation, but over many decades, and maybe you have double-digit inflation, but not 130% inflation. So I think also, just the fiscal disaster and monetary disaster that has been modern-day Argentina has also helped Milei deliver his very libertarian and Austrian school-oriented message.
Yeah, that's part of what people have just said to me. He's in the right place at the right time. That because let's compare him to say Jose Luis Espert, who didn't really do much of anything 4 years ago.
Yeah, but I mean, if you compare him with Espert, on the one hand, Espert doesn't have that talent to communicate with, especially with young people. I remember Milei was a heavy metal vocalist, if I'm not mistaken, and a soccer goalie, so he can connect on a different level. But aside from that, if you look, Esped is not in favor of dollarization. He holds on to the fantasy that Argentina can have some kind of independent central bank with technocrats somehow magically being able to devalue the currency at just the right rate. So I think, I mean, there's something of personality involved, but also I think Milei is a much more sound economist than Esped.
You know, this is one personality factor that I think is huge. You know, we've got a guy who is you know, an athlete and a musician, and really, you don't really see athletes and people who are both athletes and musicians very much. But I wonder if this went into the whole thing of becoming a showman and learning and maybe having, you know, a certain degree of confidence when he's speaking and talking about what he believes. And unfortunately, you know, that's something that a lot of libertarians unfortunately don't seem to have. They don't seem to have that kind of confidence.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, libertarianism in general, it's a very intellectual philosophy.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to read the books, you have to read the classics, and you're usually discussing these things on a very abstract level. So Milei, I don't know if it's because he was a soccer player or because he was a musician, but as I say, he definitely does have that talent, and that's why he has connected, and that's why he has connected, especially with young people. And I think that's what's been making the difference. Whereas a more traditional, bookish libertarian, even if he would have had the best ideas or exactly the same ideas, he likely would not have had the same electoral success.
Definitely, yeah, there's definitely something, and what I'm hearing too is if the voting was everybody under 40, he'd win easily.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's correct.
And considering all that, Daniel, is it? Some people have said this too that I've had on here. Is it fair to say that maybe Milei has already won anyway, even if he doesn't win? Because this could be, even if he doesn't win, you might have an army of Mileis coming up in a.
Well, look, I don't know about potential successors or any of that, but just the fact that I've been in this movement, and I'm talking about not only Colombia, but you have a lot of contact with other libertarians in other countries in Latin America. And we've been having these discussions of, we know we have the best ideas. We know that if you implement our ideas, our countries are going to prosper. But the question has always been, how do we convince people? Because the left has been far better in terms of marketing, which is kind of paradoxical if you think that the communists who want to kill free market capitalism are actually masters at marketing. So, what Milei has done, I think, is connect on that level. And when you have him, for instance, in his victory speech after the primaries in August, and what a lot of people in the U.S. who hadn't been paying attention in the media were saying that he was, a far-right candidate, or comparing him to Trump or Bolsonaro. And when you actually listen to his speech, and he is giving the definition of classical liberalism presented by Alberto Venegas Lynch, who is his mentor. And of course, Alberto Venegas Lynch is, a father figure of classical liberalism in Argentina. And not only him, his father founded a think tank in the 1950s. And he hosted Ludwig von Mises, among other Austrian school scholars. So Milei is the product of a very long and very solid libertarian, classical liberal intellectual tradition in Argentina. And Argentina has, I think, by far the most sophisticated network of think tanks. So when Milei is giving his speech and he's giving a definition of classical liberalism presented by Venegas Lynch, and he's quoting him, and he's talking about the unrestricted respect for other people's life projects based on the respect for life, liberty, and property, with free markets and the ability to enter and exit markets based on offering consumers the best possible choice. There's something philosophically very solid there. and very much in line with not only classical liberalism in the West, beginning with not only Adam Smith, but even some of his predecessors. You can even go to the School of Salamanca in terms of the Hispanic tradition. But also in terms of Argentina,
yes.
the Argentine tradition, what I call the Argentine tradition of liberty, going back with Alberdi and the 1853 Constitution. So he's tapping into that tradition. And if you're just going on a very superficial level, saying, "Oh, Milei is like, say, Bolsonaro," you really are not understanding what is really happening here.
Yeah, it's very good. And again, Alberto Menegas Lynch, you're welcome on here anytime. So, yeah. So, yeah, I've certainly talked to people who know him. I've heard a lot. I didn't know who he was at all before I started, but I've heard his name come up plenty of times. There's a lot of other good people too. Who do you think Milei is? Is there anybody really who is like him? I mean, sometimes I've thought about maybe Bukele. Somebody thought Lasso in Ecuador, and I always bring up Maria Corina Machado in Venezuela, but she's
no. I mean, in terms of charisma and personality wise, I think, and in terms of the use of humor for political purpose, I think maybe the closest comparison that I've seen, especially in recent years, is Boris Johnson. The difference is that Boris Johnson he wasn't consistent at all ideologically. He was a great messenger, I think, and a master at political humor and of making people realize what prigs the people in charge really are and have been. And he's very much in talking about the political traditions of different countries. He's very much in the cavalier tradition versus the ruling Puritan class.
Yes.
And I think Milei is similar in that respect to a certain point. There's a hair disheveled, and the use of humor and kind of not really submitting to what the preconceived notion of a politician is. But in terms of his intellectual formation and his grasp of economics, which Boris Johnson had very little, I think Milei is unparalleled and definitely no comparison with politicians like Lasso or Maria Corina Machado or even Macri or Sebastián Piñera or any of those. So I think he's definitely a breath of fresh air in that sense.
Well, I always say Boris Johnson reminds me of a 50-something version of Ron Weasley from Harry Potter.
Okay, maybe.
Yeah, but I don't know if that helps or not. But so yeah, that's a good question. Is there anybody else we maybe should be watching in South America who might be Milei in 5 or 10 years?
I think it depends a lot on the country. It depends a lot on the political situation. And as I said, it's important to understand that the Milei phenomenon, I think, doesn't arise in a vacuum. And this is not to discredit him in any way. But as I mentioned, Argentina has a long tradition of classical liberalism with people such as Alberto Venegas Lynch, Martin Krause, just recently, and many others for many years and many decades.
Yeah.
So that the groundwork was in a way already there. In other countries, I can tell you about Colombia. Colombia doesn't have that tradition. So for us to start in Colombia, we really starting pretty much from zero. And so that's an advantage that Argentina has. Other countries, for instance, Ecuador, I think, curiously, has a stronger ecosystem in terms of, for instance, classical liberal think tanks. So why? It's just down to certain figures that have been there and have worked for a long time. And some countries have that more developed than others. And I think to the extent that you're going to have successful libertarian politicians, and the great achievements that Milei has already done, whether he wins or loses, is that he has placed libertarianism on that map. Whereas before you had the alternative of the 21st century socialists and the Chavistas on the one hand, And on the other, you had these kind of conservatives in the Latin American sense. And when you look at why they are conservatives, they're conservative statists. So in the end, whether it's because they support a very strong relationship between the state and the Catholic Church, or whether they're protectionists, protecting the big monopolies from foreign competition. So in the end, you had a lot of common ground between the quote-unquote right and the left. And the one magnificent thing I think that Milei has done in Argentina, which is what we tried to do in Colombia, obviously failed, is to break through that system and present a different alternative, which is you don't have to choose between the Chavistas and the right-wing statists. You can choose the libertarians and have something completely different.
Well, the English-speaking world has this great tradition of going back to the Magna Carta, the old Whigs of the 1600s, the Glorious Revolution. And really, if you look at Spain still never had anything like the Glorious. Maybe when Franco stepped down and handed off the throne to Juan Carlos, that was something like the Glorious Revolution. But there's really no traditions. There are no traditions like that in the Spanish-speaking world.
I disagree with you on that one.
Okay.
Spain actually has a very long tradition of liberty, arguably older than the English tradition of liberty. The former Prime Minister, President of Spain, Mariano Rajoy, had to apologize a few years ago when he was in power because he referred to England as the cradle of the parliamentary system. And it turned out that even the UNESCO had recognized the city of León in Spain as the Decreta of León, which is prior to Magna Carta, as being the first document that mentions something akin to the parliamentary tradition. And Spain had a very strong tradition throughout the Middle Ages of limiting the power of the kings. So, for instance, what became the Basque provinces, they refused to pay taxes to the kings of Castilla and León, and they would only pay donatives. Basically, it was a voluntary gift. And the system of the fueros and the cortes, which were privileges, especially for the nobles and the clerisy, that was not dissimilar to the privileges created out of Magna Carta for nobles. So you have that same tradition of liberty and resisting central power in Spain. The thing is that you lose that. Of course, a lot has to do with the way that the Reconquista played out, and also the arrival of the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs do quite a bit to end that tradition, but it's really the Bourbons, the dynasty following the Habsburgs, that really put an end to that, and they bring this French model of centralization. But if you go far enough back into Spanish history, you will find a very rich tradition of liberty. And I think our task as Hispanic or Spanish-speaking or Ibero-American libertarians, to put it that way, is to rescue this Spanish tradition of liberty, because that's where the School of Salamanca really arises. And this is prior to Adam Smith, and prior to the founding of the United States, and actually the former president of Universidad Francisco Marroquín in Guatemala, Javier Calzada, wrote quite a bit about how, for instance, people like John Locke and Thomas Jefferson were reading scholars like Juan de Mariana in the School of Salamanca tradition. And even in Cervantes' Don Quixote, there's a strong influence of the School of Salamanca. My friend Derek Graff has written and taught about that quite a bit. So I think there's a very strong tradition of liberty in the Spanish-speaking world, and it's a matter of rescuing that tradition. And I think, to a certain extent, even if he's not explicitly, verbally going back that far, because Milei talks a lot, especially about Alberti, there is a older and deeper tradition of liberty that we really have to tap into.
What was that? The director of León or something like that?
The Decreta.
The Decreta.
Decreta of León. Yeah.
The Decreta.
Yeah, it's like basically the decrees of León, and it's considered the first document that refers to what we could recognize as a parliamentary system.
Well, the last 5 minutes have definitely been an education. I was not aware of any of this. I don't know how much of it's been translated into English. Of course, I am aware of Ortega y Gasset and
oh sure, yeah,
and of course Alberto Vargas the guy from Peru, Alberto
Mario Vargas Llosa.
Mario Vargas Llosa, yeah.
And his son is called Álvaro.
Yes, I'm aware of that, but I knew about the School of Salamanca, but I didn't realize there was a different tradition there. But certainly that would certainly be great because
Yeah, well, I mean, the School of Salamanca is important because you have people like Mariana and Francisco Suarez there. And Mariana basically saying, if you debase the currency, talking about Argentina right now, it's an act of tyranny. A king can't just debase the currency because it's stealing from the people. So there's a very deep notion of popular sovereignty. So the king is there. Ultimately, there's a contract. And Mariana and Suarez say not only that the king has to respect that contract and especially respect the currency and the value of the currency, but that if that contract is broken on the part of the king, then the people have the right to engage in tyrannicide.
Yeah.
And this is, a very important notion. And you also have other figures of the School of Salamanca, for instance, confirming the subjective nature of prices and basically the moral view of the market. And this is long before the time of Adam Smith. So there you go.
Yes, and Spain certainly had its own impact on American history. The pieces of 8 with a quarter being 2 bits, and that's really kind of an obsolete term now. But it was something people say. If you ask for a quarter, you ask for 2 bits, and yeah, it's definitely. I mean, certainly the Spanish influence was here. I wasn't aware of this, and it wasn't uncommon. Especially with the early founding fathers. I mean, a lot of them, like Adams and Jefferson. I mean, they learned Latin, they learned Greek, they learned Spanish, they learned all these languages and studied all these works. It was
absolutely. You have to bring that back. I mean, I'm a classicist, so I'm all in favor of bringing back Latin and Greek.
I'd like to know when was the last time we had a president who knew Latin and Greek? America.
In the U.S., I think one of the Bushes had Latin in high school. I think that was the last one, maybe.
Yeah. Jefferson, but maybe the second.
Oh, all the founding fathers were maybe with the exception of George Washington.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is that if you went to college in those days, you had to at least pass exams in
maybe John Quincy Adams.
So no, you probably have long before that. I mean, that's not my specialty, but I assume many of your 20th century presidents would have had some basic knowledge of Latin. In the UK, I already mentioned Boris Johnson. He's a classicist by training. And before that, I think Harold Macmillan, when he was wounded in World War I, it's an anecdote that as he was injecting himself with morphine, he was reading Aeschylus in Greek. And I think that's the kind of politician you want to, even though, I mean, I don't think his economic policies were that good.
Yeah, that's great to hear about this Spanish tradition, though. It's probably a lot more things to learn, though, than we could expect.
What do
you think went wrong? What do you think went wrong for Spain, especially in the 20th century? I mean,
well, I mean, I think it predates the 20th century, but as I said before, I think just the fact that you had that contact with a very aggressive version of Islam, which leads to the Reconquista, that also leads to a very centralized state.
Yes, it does.
And that basically the end of the Reconquista coincides with the beginning of the conquest of the Americas. So the type of Catholicism that is exported to Latin America is very different to the Catholicism that came to the U.S. Maryland was practically a Catholic colony, but it's a different kind of Catholicism. So Latin American Catholicism is a lot, as I said, it's a lot more militant and it's a lot more Baroque. So there's a lot of emphasis on suffering and martyrs and saints. And I think the left in the 20th century and 21st century in Latin America has been very skillful in tapping into that Catholic tradition. So just to give you an example, in Colombia, our current president, Pedro, he's a Marxist.
Yeah.
And if you look at his campaign material and his slogans and logos, he had a heart. Even when he was mayor of Bogota, his movement was called like Bogota Humana, Human Bogota. And he had a heart, and then he made it into Colombia, and into Colombia Humana. And you would think, like, what's the use of the heart? But then you realize in Colombia, especially, and many other countries, the Sacred Heart is a very strong Catholic symbol. So when you use the heart in politics, you're really exploiting that at a very subliminal level. So they're very good at that kind of thing. And really, the right, well, I mentioned some of the problems with the right, but also, let's say, libertarians, we're very good at showing charts and graphs of why our ideas work and lead to economic growth and prosperity. But if you're just talking on that level and you're ignoring that other very deep cultural and even subliminal level, you're not going to be on the same plane as some of these other people. So I think that's what's been lacking a little bit.
And from what I hear, the communists in South America really haven't attacked the church the way the original Bolsheviks did.
No, to the contrary. In Colombia, a lot of our guerrilla leaders have been Spanish priests.
Yeah.
So you had one guy who came in the late 60s or early 70s from Spain, a priest, and he ended up being the leader of one of the two large guerrilla groups. And he's not the only one, by the way. And if you look at the iconography of Che Guevara, it's purely religious, the message that it's trying to convey. So they've been very skillful and able to kind of mesh their socialist, and that's what, in the end, that's what liberation theology is.
Yeah, and unlike the American left, the South American version of leftism was also very, very anti-gay.
Yeah, I think so.
Castro and Allende, they
even,
both.
I mean, and not even
things about gays. Yeah, they said gay homosexuality was a product of communism,
right?
A product of capitalism.
And this isn't even so long ago. A few years ago, Evo Morales, of course, was the 21st century strongman of Bolivia, who was ousted in a coup because he ignored a referendum that didn't allow him to run for re-election. Then he tried to steal the election. But anyway, a few years ago, he was saying that the consumption of chicken caused homosexuality. This was just like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, or maybe a bit more. But
in America, chicken is also a slang term for a person who's scared. You're too chicken to fight. Do they say that in Spanish too, or not?
Yeah, but I don't think that's where he was going to. I think he was talking about certain chemicals in chicken.
Yeah, I just wondered if that's where that came from, because it's funny how that's slang and you may not make any sense. It's a different thing. What else do you think? It also looks like Milei is very good at using the internet, and he's making good use of YouTube and social media that I don't know if other libertarians have really done that well.
Yeah, and I mean, yes, that's correct. But I also wonder to what extent he's doing it, or to what extent it's his followers, and it's very much organic. And you see channels that are just channels, from what I can tell, created and managed by his fans that get hundreds of thousands of views. And what they're doing is that they're just posting snippets from his interviews or even whole interviews that he does on more traditional media. But I think he was very skilled, as we mentioned at the beginning, at the use of television, and that was, of course, taken into social media. So I think that's been his main channel, of course, and he's been incredibly successful.
Yeah, he's been very successful. That's one thing that I think some people are a little bit scared, because he seems like he's too populist. I mean, I see some people like Antonella Marti isn't very positive about him. And there's another guy named, is it Jose Tuit on Twitter? They seem to be somewhat free market, but they're not. But they're worried that he's acting like a populist, as they like to say.
Yeah, well, in Argentina,
those concerns.
I mean, I mentioned the strong classical liberal tradition in Argentina, and you have today you have different bands, and I don't know to what percentage they support Milei or oppose him, but some, we can say, classical liberals oppose Milei because they say, right, as you say, he's a populist and they don't approve his methods and of screaming and insulting people. And I must say, at the beginning, I was a bit skeptical because I thought this could backfire, and maybe insulting your opponents is not the best strategy if you want to present libertarianism as a viable strategy or option. But of course, I was completely wrong in terms of it. Definitely worked for Milei. And yeah, you have people who don't like him. But one thing I have noticed is that some of his critics, even on this side of the political spectrum, policy-wise, they're not really convincing me, at least. And I can tell that there's a lot of personal animus against Milei.
Yeah, and some people said that there's one article written by a guy who goes by he goes by the name Bronze Age Pervert, but he says they've really had these kind of leaders for decades with these kind of delivery. But he said this could just be another populist movement that doesn't work. But I don't. But I think Milei has a really strong ideology here, and I don't. So I think he's going to.
Well, I mean, as I said, he constantly explains on national TV, and I don't know how many people can digest it or understand it fully, but he says that classical liberalism is the unrestricted respect for another person's life project based on the respect for life, liberty, and property, and free markets. So, I mean, he's very explicit about it. That's his ideology. That's what he's defending. And he's been very consistent, I think, ideologically. The other day, Alberto Neguas Lynch was saying at his rally that usually candidates, when they're about to win an election, they kind of moderate their proposals or their positions because they want to maybe not scare some people off or bring some people into the tent. And I think that until now, Milei has been very consistent. And for instance, he's been very much criticized for dollarization, which Cato has been writing about dollarization in Latin America for decades.
Yeah,
I think we're the only institution that has done so. I mean, of course, the IMF and World Bank have commented on dollarization, but they usually oppose it. So when Ecuador dollarized in 2000, the IMF was opposed. They had to do it against the wishes of the IMF. And Milei, even in the face of all this criticism, he's been very consistent and steadfast in the need to dollarize Argentina. And I think that's also part of the reason for his success. And as Venegas Lynch was saying, he hasn't kind of toned down that very consistent ideological message, but he has actually doubled down. And I think that's been a good thing.
Yeah. Well, it seems like Milei seems to have an understanding of, like a doctor, he's got to treat the immediate symptoms, but he's also got to treat the disease. Sure. And dollarization is just a way of treating the symptom now and trying to get Argentina back to some kind of healthy system. One thing I want to ask you about too is, I assume that the colleges are in South America, and I keep asking this, I probably know the answer, but the colleges in South America are as bad as worse as they are in America, right? I mean, they're all a bunch of the professors are all socialists or.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty bad. And you have to take into account that if it's bad here, in Latin American academia loves to import the worst parts of U.S. academia.
Yeah.
So in a certain sense, it's even worse because it's, let's say, to the extent that quote unquote woke culture has taken over. It's not even a homegrown phenomenon. It's all imported. So, and by the way, these are the people who hate American culture and American products.
Yeah.
But they love to import the worst parts of American academia.
And America has sometimes not put its best foot forward with South America. I mean, we've supported I mean, they're too. I mean, most of the people who say they're capitalists, they're really crony capitalists.
Yeah, totally.
They claim to be Henry Reardon, but they're actually Orrin Boyle. It's, and I don't know how. And Milei, I think, has talked about that. He said, these people need to be stewards, need to be protectors of capitalism, and they don't seem to care. I don't know.
Right, and well, to be fair, I mean, even Milton Friedman commented on how, the worst enemies of the free market are usually entrenched business interests, big business interests, interested in having government step in and protect their dominant positions. And I mean, I have nothing against a company that earns its dominant position, but in Latin America, when that happens, it's usually because of government connections and government protection. Certainly the case in Colombia. I think certainly the case in Argentina too. And that's why it's important to have this alternative of libertarianism and having people understand what you have here. It's not even capitalism, because it's a completely rigged system. And to a certain extent, that's why it's difficult to make the argument, because the left, in a way, is right when they criticize those companies and their relations with politicians and with the ruling class in general. But at the same time, of course, the remedy that the left offers is far worse.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to say you don't have to choose either of these alternatives. You have this other alternative, which is the free market and limited government. And that's why it's such an achievement that Milei has gotten that message through in Argentina. And whatever happens, I think you were hinting at this earlier, from now on, it will be easier to make that kind of argument in other countries.
As my mind wanders sometimes, you've used the term classical liberalism a lot, and I've just been saying we've got to call it something else, because I mean it's like saying we're has-been liberals, something to make it sound cool, and maybe we could call it rock star liberalism or cool liberalism.
The thing is,
I think cool liberalism would be great. You know what I'm trying to get at here?
Yeah, the problem is, for instance, in Colombia, you can't speak about liberalism because there's a liberal party. It's one of the main parties. And it, just to make a long story short, it's a member of the Socialist International.
Oh yeah, I know. So, I understand. I understand.
And
classical
in Argentina, actually, Milei uses the term liberalism because in Argentina, liberalism has maintained its original meaning.
Yeah.
So it depends a lot on the country. And in the U.S., of course, you can't say liberalism because people understand something. So, I mean, do you need a new term or not? I don't know.
I mean, there are thousands of words in the English language, and you choose a word that is synonymous with saying I'm old, I'm antiquated, I'm has been, I used to be popular, but I'm not popular anymore. It's just
Sure, but that might be, but the fact is that it is liberalism, pure liberalism.
Yeah, it's pure liberalism. Yeah, any word would be better. And I always seem to get into this debate, and people just it's because
of course that's why the word libertarianism arose.
Yeah,
in the U.S. So.
Yeah. Before we go, any comments on Ecuador and their election recently?
I mean, the thing is that this is it's an exceptional election, because the president who actually had the full term, Lasso, had to resign for reasons of corruption. So he basically called this sui generis election, and the person who won, Novoa, the candidate who won, he's only going to be in for about a year and a half.
Okay.
So I think he can run for re-election, but the point is that there's going to be another election very soon. And I think the bigger story is that Correa's candidate, who was a very weak candidate, but just the fact that she was supported by Correa gave her 48% of the vote. So it's definitely not the end of Correísmo or 21st century socialism in Ecuador.
Yeah.
But the big difference between Ecuador and, say, Venezuela, I mean, Rafael Correa was not too dissimilar from Chavez. And if you look at what he did in terms of dismantling the existing institutions. He also changed the constitution so as to run for re-election, shut down and pressured independent media and journalists. So you name it, really. But the difference is that Ecuador had the dollar and Venezuela didn't.
Yeah.
So Chavez was able to take over the central bank and
Yeah.
destroy the currency. Whereas dollarization really saved Ecuador from a very different and worse scenario. So that is still the case, but there are still some aspects of Ecuador's dollarization that are worrisome. For instance, Panama, which is dollarized, of course, too, doesn't have a central bank. And that's the ideal scenario, which, by the way, is what Milei is proposing for Argentina. In Ecuador, they maintained the central bank after dollarization, and that allowed Correa to concentrate foreign reserves in the central bank, and he financed his completely profligate public spending through loans from the central bank. So the fact that Ecuador still has a central bank is worrisome. And for Correa, that was just the first step to de-dollarize, which he wasn't able to do. So it's just things to keep in mind and to watch out for in Ecuador in the coming years.
Well, thank you. You got anything else to say before we go?
Not much. The only thing I'll say is that my colleague Gabriela Calderon and I published an article, a policy brief on dollarization, saying Argentina should dollarize in July. Nobody paid any attention to it, and then a few weeks after, when Milei won, then everyone started talking about dollarization. So, and if he wins on Sunday, I think you're going to hear a lot more about it. So,
well, that was where I found you, and I definitely want to talk about Colombia sometime. Maybe more about the history of Spanish liberalism. That might be.
Oh yeah, that's well, both. Colombia is a subject for a whole conversation, and the history of what I call the Hispanic tradition of liberty. I have an article, by the way, if you're interested, I can send it to you.
Yeah.
Sure, they published it in English on Reason a few years ago. It's called the Hispanic Tradition of Liberty, and I go into it a little bit. And I published it in Spanish and FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education in Spanish. They have a website.
Well, I've got some connections, so yeah.
Yeah.
This could be the most important election in the history of the world, Daniel. Let's hope for it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You never know, because Argentina is not really considered a global player, but I think it's very important in Latin America. It's still a very influential country. And dollarization so far has gone under the radar because the $3 countries are small and maybe not very influential. Panama, Ecuador, and El Salvador. But if Argentina dollarizes, I think, and I've said, it will be a regional watershed. And all these other countries will start saying, well, why do we have these depreciated national currencies when Argentina has a dollar, if it's successful there? And successful dollarization implies not only dollarizing, which will get rid of inflation, but if you want to have dollarization and economic growth, you have to come up with all these other reforms. Like, for instance, Panama completely liberalized its banking system in the 1970s. And if Argentina does that under Milei, which will be difficult, but if he manages that, and Argentina dollarizes successfully, and they have not only dollarization and low inflation and economic growth, then I think other countries will start considering that as well. And if you look at it from the American perspective, if you start having kind of a common currency zone in Latin America with the dollar, you don't want to repeat the same mistakes as the European Union with the euro or the eurozone and having like a common fiscal policy or anything like that. But if you do something like allow Latin American countries that are democratic republics, not like Venezuela or Cuba, but if you allow the, let's say, quote unquote, friendly countries to join USMCA, which is NAFTA 2.0, and you start creating a free trade zone across the Americas bit by bit, that could really change the region, and I think it would be tremendously helpful. And I think that's where we should be looking for in the long term.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. And just hope that he frees up the economy and makes it easy, because I see Argentina so low on these economic freedom indexes. I mean, it almost looks like it's almost as bad as Venezuela, and that's saying a lot. So, well, thank you very much, Daniel. It's been great having you on here. And
thank you so much.
we're 2 days away. So thank you very much. Please like the video, follow the channel, subscribe to the channel, give it a thumbs up. Go buy my novel, Escape from the Village. Check out my Substack. And I'm Chris Baker. We're out.